There's almost nothing the media love more than secret videotapes. And here was the architect of Obamacare, MIT professor Jonathan Gruber, admitting to an academic conference that health care law was deliberately designed to disguise the fact that it contained a tax that would, in effect, transfer money to poorer patients.
Lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass.
This was played as a very big story on Fox News.
Caught on camera, a stunning admission from one of the architects of Obamacare.
In the last 24 hours, a scandal involving a key White House advisor has blown up.
New developments on the Obamacare architect who was caught on video admitting the White House preyed on the, quote, stupidity of the American voter to get the health care law passed.
But this was a non-story for days as far as the network news divisions were concerned. Not a word in the New York Times until yesterday. Very little on MSNBC. CNN's Jake Tapper was an exception at his network, covering the story several times. Other news organizations, CBS, Washington Post, finally catching up days later. Joining us now to examine this huge gap in coverage, Sharyl Attkisson, former CBS News reporter and author of Stonewalled, My Fight for Truth Against the Forces of Obstruction, Intimidation and Harassment in Obama's Washington, which debuts at number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. Allison Barber, staff writer at the Washington Free Beacon, and Julie Roginski, a Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor. Sharyl, the Gruber video, was it important news? Is it important news? And why hadn't it gotten more coverage?
I think it was really big news. The first thing that I thought of when I heard that was something came to mind, an equivalent video, perhaps some might say, the Romney 47% video that was recorded surreptitiously that was exposed. And I know my own network where I worked, CBS, jumped on that and aired it night after night. I would say
Romney was the presidential candidate at the time. Gruber, hardly a household name.
Well, but the difference that I think makes the Gruber video perhaps arguably more important is Romney's talking about, as a candidate, his own sort of political theory. Gruber's talking about something that was actually imposed on the American people. And think about the magnitude of what he's saying. He's saying this initiative was something that they had to mislead and deceive the public about in order to get it passed. I think that's big news.
Why for days did these major news organizations, from the network newscast to the Time, New York Times, and others, decide this had zero news value?
I don't think there's a good excuse for it. I think this is something that was actually made for news, particularly broadcast news, to pick up on. It wasn't a grainy audio video. It wasn't a written account. It was actually a very clear, good video. And
it wasn't some complicated memo that had to be interpreted and explained.
It's very clear, and people love videos. It's something that they can easily digest and they can take and interpret for themselves. So it was perfect for that. And you mentioned that he's hardly a household name, and in some ways he's not. I think most health policy reporters know who he is, but you also have to remember that this is the guy that had the tape that came out in July that is going to impact the Halberg Supreme Court case. I think that alone makes him a person who is noteworthy and newsworthy, to where things he says now should still be important, particularly when what he has said that is going to play into the Halberg case in the past is going to potentially have a significant impact on this law. And
ABC and NBC, Julie, talked about this a little bit on their Sunday shows today. As far as we can tell, that's the first time on those two network newscasts. Don't the media usually love secret videos where somebody says something at the very least is embarrassing?
They do. And look, this is a legitimate story. As a Democrat, I may not be thrilled with it, but it's definitely something that's legitimate, something to talk about. And I think part of it is that he's not a household name, but part of it has to be that I think there's a media bias towards Obamacare being an old story. It's implemented. It's not going anywhere. I think the media pretty much acknowledges that, Supreme Court aside. And so therefore people feel
like, let's move on.
Let's move on. But look, I don't think that's a legitimate belief. Because
how are you the news if you're taking a story and maybe 3 to 4 to 5 days later reporting on something that everybody's already been able to hear and learn about?
When Jonathan Gruber was doing damage control, he did go on MSNBC. He went on Ronan Farrow's afternoon show. Let's play a little bit of that, and I'll ask you about it on the other side.
I was speaking off the cuff, and I basically spoke inappropriately, and I regret having made those comments.
But your point that you were making underneath the choice of words was actually quite nuanced. You were saying, essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, that due to political pressures, the language of Obamacare had to be somewhat opaque.
I think the most notable, I'll let your other guests comment more on that. The most notable thing about that clip is part you didn't see. They summarily dispensed with the discussion about the video, and then the interviewer went on to ask him current questions about healthcare.gov from the guy who just admitted everything I said before was perhaps, a party to misleading the public with a certain intent. Why would you even use him as an expert now?
Gruber comes on and says, I spoke inappropriately. It kind of cried out for a follow-up question. What was inappropriate? Do you still believe this? Are you taking
and they
back.
just moved on.
Right. Now, I'm not one to cry bias every 12 minutes, but I do think it's hard to come up with another explanation other than utter cluelessness on this one. And sometimes I say, well, you know, other stories were dominating the news and they sucked up the oxygen. But there's nobody in America who has Ebola anymore. It's hard to point to that as a potential alibi.
Right. I think Julie's right in that there is a bunch of, I guess, histrionics that surround it, particularly when Republicans bring up Obamacare, that I think people naturally kind of look at, and a lot of people in the media think this has been covered enough, it's been beat to death, we have a lot of these talking points that we feel like we're getting, so we kind of want to ignore it. And I think that's the wrong approach to take. This is an incredibly important legislation that changed an entire industry. It's something that people should be watching like a hawk, and they don't do it very often. And I think that the bias may not necessarily be a left or right bias, but just what Julia said is that kind of people are maybe, for whatever reason, feel like they're tired of it and they don't want to go back to it.
It's almost like a rock, right? I mean, people are so exhausted by this particular narrative. It's been going on for year after year after year. Again, I'm not legitimizing the fact that people have been ignoring the story. I think the Gruber story is very legitimate, but I think part of it is this ennui that's been pervasive throughout the press corps and among viewers, where can we move on to something else, something a little bit more...
Except it's not like this is something in the history books of the open enrollment period. The second one started yesterday for Obamacare. But let me flip the question. This has generated dozens of segments on Fox. Do you think Fox News has overplayed it?
Well, do I think Fox News has overplayed it? I think Fox News has traditionally been the network that has taken a much heavier view of Obamacare than others. I think that having worked at a different network before Fox, when Obamacare was being implemented, actually CNBC, which you're going to be talking about later, Fox News has always been much more in the Obamacare story than other places, and so I think about this is just part of the course for Fox News.
Yeah, and I would just say the fact that belatedly, for example, the Associated Press ran its first story, remember this broke on Monday, first story on Friday, late Friday afternoon, and belatedly other organizations saying, yeah, I guess we ought to talk about the furor this has caused. Well, where were they for days? Now, Julie kind of set me up for this question. Melissa Francis will have her on in a few minutes. Former CNBC anchor says on her show on Friday, I happened to be on with her, that when she criticized the math of Obamacare, saying the numbers didn't add up, in her view, she was called on the carpet by management and silenced, as she says. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not terribly surprised if she's giving an accurate account, because I've never been called into management told that, you know, you're being a bad American or anything like that. But I certainly have gotten signals when I've been doing stories, particularly ones that they perceive to be critical of this administration.
They being CBS, where you worked for 20 years.
Yes, I definitely got signals, especially the last couple of years, that that was something that they did not want. And I think that I've heard stories from other reporters, and some of them are in my book, and some have spoken by name. But maybe we'll be hearing more people come forward and actually give these accounts publicly.
Were these, just briefly, were these subtle signals or pretty unmistakable?
A mix. Sometimes it was unmistakable. My producer and I understood, at least we thought we understood what was being implied to us.
And if the stories are not getting on the air, that's the strongest signal of all.
Right.